Thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I was delighted to be asked to speak at this conference. Slightly worried about being the first on stage, but I hope you will be interested in what I've got to say. And just a little bit warning, there will be a bit of audience participation a bit later on, so please don't fall asleep. We've heard a lot about AI in the last few weeks, and it seems that data, the analysis of data, the collection of data, machine learning, algorithms, AI are all now put into one pot when they're talked about publicly. Here's a few things that people have said over the last few weeks. In the introduction to the AI Safety Summit that was held at Bletchley Park recently, it was stated that different variables, how the AI is designed, the uses to which it is put, the data on which it is trained, can interact in ways that are near impossible to predict. The Prime Minister said in his speech on AI related to the summit, how can we write laws that make sense for something that we don't yet fully understand? And then I noticed this quote from the Facebook co-founder, who was quoted in The Independent, again, all around the coverage of the AI summit. And he said, large language models are not compatible with GDPR, with data protection and the right to be forgotten. So you either ignore that law, which perhaps many are, or you need a new one. So that got me thinking, maybe we should all just give up now and go for coffee. Hold on a minute. Other views are available. And here's one of them. The US Vice President Kamala Harris gave what I thought was a very good speech at the AI summit, or just before the summit began. And she talks about the implications of the use of data and the use of AI. And she said, when a senior is kicked off his healthcare plan because of a faulty AI algorithm, is that not existential for him? I thought very clever turning around of that use of existential that we've heard such a lot about in connection with the summit. When a young father is wrongfully imprisoned because of biased AI facial recognition, is that not existential for his family? And there have been a number of wrongful arrests in the US in connection with misidentification due to facial recognition. She went on to say, as history has shown, in the absence of regulation and strong government oversight, some technology companies choose to prioritize profit over the well-being of customers and the safety of communities and the stability of democracies. We might add to that perhaps sometimes state bodies have chosen to prioritize efficiency and automation over decision-making, accuracy, and fairness. And we saw that in this country with the Post Office Horizon scandal and the failure to really investigate what was going on behind the scenes in that computer software. I was really glad that she mentioned history and what we already know, because we already know a lot about how we should use data and how we should regulate it. And the history of the law shows us that if you don't clearly control, monitor, limit, license, or stop something happening, people will go on and do it. the undesirable thing anyway. So we might think about factory machines without guardrails. We might think about driving while using a mobile phone, or firearms licensing requirements and the data collection and analysis needed to decide on people's suitability to own a gun. Of course, people will choose to do things even if they are unlawful or controlled, but fewer will, and the law and regulation sends a clear message about acceptable behaviour, or the principles that we should use to decide whether to do something or not. And where things are not regulated, or where regulation and standards are not seen as important, bad things can happen, as sadly we saw from the Titan sub-tragedy. But this conference is about data and not submarines, you might be thinking. Yes, it is. And two of our most important laws, the European Convention on Human Rights and the Data Protection Act, stem in part from the aim of ensuring that the abuse of data carried out by the Nazi regime and others could never happen again. We see on the slide here on the right, women at work in the German Census Bureau in 1933. And the center column instructs that number 3 is the indicator to be used for Jews. And as I'm sure we're all aware, the Nazis used a combination of records to identify Jews, paper records, records created by Jewish communities themselves, parish records of Protestant and Catholic churches for converted Jews, government tax records, and police records. And punch card machines, such as the Hollerith machine on the left, were used to process and sort information on households that had been gathered in the census. So it was a way of processing those aggregated census data to provide information on how many Jews lived in particular cities. The Ministry of State Security in communist East Germany, otherwise known as the Stasi, took data collection and surveillance to new levels. I read when preparing this talk that apparently the Stasi record archive contains 111 kilometers of files, which is apparently a file for 1 in every citizen. Again, as I'm sure we're all aware, methods include tapped phones, searched mail, interrogation, bugging devices, and 500,000 unpaid informants. And linking all that data together was very important. Meticulously researched file cards with the name, age, occupation, and habits were cross-referenced in complex paper-based databases. Unsurprisingly, in the aftermath of the Second World War, it was felt that something needed to be done, and the European Convention on Human Rights was born, with its provisions developed by much input from British lawyers. And what the ECHR aims to do is to codify fundamental rights in law in order to safeguard and protect people from disproportionate actions of the state, and to have a special court that countries will subject themselves to adjudicate on disputes. In the ECHR, there are a mixture of absolute rights, which are not subject to limitations or exceptions, and other rights which are called qualified rights, which can be restricted by the state in some circumstances and subject to proportionality limits. So just this morning, if you've been on X, I can't call it X either, on Twitter, you will see that the Supreme Court has ruled on the government's Rwanda asylum policy, ruling it unlawful. Some people are like to clap that. Ruling that there are substantial grounds for believing that genuine refugees at risk of being returned to countries from which they have fled will be subject to inhumane treatment. And I would be very surprised if in that judgment there is not a reference to Article 3 of the ECHR, which is the right to be free from torture and inhuman or degrading treatment. So that judgment is an example of the ECHR in practice as we are sitting here. Also of particular relevance to the use of data and the data analysis that we were talking about earlier is Article 8, which is the right to respect for private and family life, home and correspondence. And that's often summarized as the right to privacy. But it's always worth thinking about the full rights and the way it's expressed. And also, excuse me, the right to freedom of expression is a qualified right. And again, that's a very relevant one to all the debates in the news at the moment about protest, how far can protest go until the state is justified in intervening. So we have law. But again, you might be thinking, I only do research with data. I only do research. Why are human rights relevant to my work? I think they always are, because just as on this photo, it's really difficult to distinguish between sea and sky and cloud and mountain. Where does one thing begin and the other end? It's often hard to decide where data and research ends and policy and practice and operational intervention begins. All these things are informed by the others. And Emma and I were just talking about that earlier, about how it's important to think, even if we're doing theoretical research, what the consequences might be of the outputs of that research. How might it be used? How might data be deployed? I'd like to consider a couple of examples. I do a lot of work with the police and the way that they use data analytics, machine learning, and other forms of AI, such as facial recognition. And I chair a data ethics committee for West Midlands Police in this great city. And it's really come across to me when looking at the projects that the police do, that they use research outputs to inform the way that they then create their data analytics tool within the forces. So they spend a lot of time actually reading research. You might be pleased to hear that, or maybe slightly alarmed. But a lot of the documentation that is put before the committee is highly informed by research outputs. So let's consider how this grey area, this grey line, these fuzzy lines between research, data, policy, and operational interventions might work in that context. So perhaps a research project might be linking administrative data relating to deprivation, geography, and recorded crime, and drawing conclusions about correlation and possible causation. Using the process I've just described, these conclusions feed into the development of a statistical forecasting tool developed to predict locations where crime might be most likely to occur. This tool is then built into a police force's central data analytics control room, and many of the big forces now have these very centralized tools that will enable strategic commanders to actually look at all the data relating to their area in pretty much real time. So this tool is built into that control process in order to decide where to send police patrols. So that might result in more stop and searches and arrests in those locations. And importantly, fewer resources being deployed elsewhere. So we might have another research project linking age, education, social care data, socio-demographic data, address, and criminal offending data. Again, to draw conclusions about correlations. Again, that research is used to determine the variables that are going to go into a statistical model using certain risk factors, which that predicts this time not on a location basis, but an individual's likelihood of future knife crime, of committing that offence. This is actually what goes on, by the way. So there are these tools in play at the moment. A number of police forces deploy the tool in their decision-making about where to focus their efforts. So they will talk about using these tools to decide on police interventions. So that might be to prioritize an individual for visits or referral to particular programs. If they are a child, a youth, they might have their school notified and perhaps even local social services of their risk of being involved in knife crime. Now, clearly, there's sort of balancing act to be achieved here. Of course, we want research to be used for policy and strategy to change behaviours for individuals for the public good. But I think in policing, there is a risk of moving sort of statistical-based research into environments where decisions are being made about individuals. This is a quote from a report that I wrote a few years ago with Sasha Babuta. We comment that high accuracy rates at group levels or at sort of research level can often conceal very low accuracy rates for specific individuals that may not be understood or taken into account when deploying those research outputs. So in other words, you know, the research might be very good for our blue-headed parrots here, but not at all appropriate for our red-headed parrot. And I think that detective fiction can teach us a lot, so I always like to use a quote from Sherlock Holmes because he tells me what I really need to know. While the individual man is an insoluble puzzle, in the aggregate he becomes a mathematical certainty. You can, for example, never foretell what any one man will do, but you can say with precision what an average number will be up to. Individuals vary, but percentages remain constant. And, you know, who knows what he might think about women. He wasn't very keen on them. So if we use a data-driven tool with a high level of false positives to decide on an action that affects a person's life, human rights issues, as we've just gone through, may well arise. And conversely, if we have data, should we not be using it for the public good? The ECHR reminds us that people have a right to life. They have all sorts of different rights. that the public sector have a responsibility to protect. It's not just a sort of limiting piece of law. If we collect data and analyse it for one reason, but don't really understand the full implications or don't act on the analysis, then in extreme cases, risks to individuals can be missed, and we might ask why other patterns weren't spotted. And the case of the murder of Daniel Pelker back in 2012 by his parents and many other sad cases like this highlight the importance of really using data to spot vulnerabilities and spot safeguarding issues, for example. In the work for West Midlands Police, we were asked to look at a new tool that had been developed, which very cleverly brought together all sorts of disparate databases and information to try and spot risks of links with organised criminality. On this database, there was a 12-year-old child who was highlighted, or was just there on the database. So we asked to click on that person's record. That record showed that that person had committed a crime, but was linked with an address that had a link with organised criminality and had a link with domestic violence and drug offences. That highlights a high level of need for safeguarding for that child. Not that that child is a criminal, but that, like Daniel Pelker, something should have been done for them. But that tool was not highlighting that child to the police. There was no way that a police officer would have known to address that record or look into that record. So it's all very well us putting all this data together, but then what does it mean for the individuals like Daniel who need help, and that the data could help highlight that? How are we doing for time? Yeah, we've got a bit of time for some audience participation. Be glad to hear. So I thought I'd better actually show you a bit of law. Like, oh no. So we've been talking a lot about the ECHR and its importance to thinking about data and how the public sector in particular uses AI. So this is the key test that, again, I'm sure the Supreme Court will refer to in its judgment, around proportionality. It's a really key concept in human rights law. And it helps decide whether we can do something, basically, that might infringe on somebody's rights. So it gives us a very structured test to use. It requires that we ask, is there a sufficiently important objective to justify limiting a fundamental right? Is there a pressing social need out there? Is the thing that we want to do rationally connected to it? Is it actually going to help us achieve that objective? And then really importantly, is the thing we want to do no more than necessary to accompany the objective? Is a less intrusive means available? And I imagine the Supreme Court will be saying there is definitely a less intrusive means available to achieve the government's asylum aims, rather than sending people to a country where they are at high risk of further abuse. So the concept there is what you're doing a sledgehammer to crack a nut? Are you trying to do more than really is necessary? And then finally, is there a fair balance between the individual and what society needs, the interests of the community? So it can seem a bit sort of dry, but actually if we apply it to the sort of examples in policing that I mentioned, it can help us come up with a way of deciding what to do. So again, we might be researching the link between school exclusions, antisocial behaviour, and serious crime in later life. And the police decide that this research might help them assess risk and decide what to do in these circumstances. So also want to start collect education data in order to combine it for predictive purposes. So this test will require the police to look at what social need would justify this. Would actually doing this, creating a predictive tool, actually give you anything of value? And therefore, could it be said to be rationally connected to the aim? Are there other ways of doing that rather than collecting education data by the police that would be less intrusive, that could achieve the same objective? And in those circumstances, we might well find that there are. Machine learning, as well as data analytics, statistical analytics, is hugely important now in all sorts of public sector environments where data is being analysed for decision-making purposes. So I'd like to tell you a bit about an algorithm that was previously created in a policing context, but is no longer in use, and to ask you to make some decisions around it. So this is an algorithm that is created by random forest machine learning, which many of you, I'm sure, know much more than me about, using predictor variables that include criminal offence history, the harm category of each offence, that's how much harm to society an offence is deemed to carry out, age, gender, residential address, number of intelligence mentions, that's the number of times that somebody features in police intelligence records, the time since the last offence, and what the offence that they've been arrested for is. So there's quite a lot of variables that go into this algorithm. And when the machine learning algorithm has been created, there are a number of these variables that are seen as particularly important for determining the categorization of an individual. And the first one is postcode. That is regarded as an important predictor variable for determining whether somebody is going to be high risk or not, as is the number of intelligence mentions. So the number of times that somebody has featured in police intelligence. And also, as you might expect, lots of prior offences means that somebody is likely to be predicted as high risk. So, taking all that into account, that algorithm, I'd like you to now be that algorithm. So you're not allowed to have any other views. You are just that algorithm. You're allowed to take into account the variables, but the most important variables, as I've just explained, are going to be the postcode of where the person lives, their prior offences, and the number of intelligence mentions. So I'm going to tell you about a person. This person is male, age 25. They live in residential addressed mosaic category K46. Don't know whether that's still K46, but it was then, which is high-rise residents, renters of social flats in high-rise blocks where levels of need are significant. They were arrested for ABH, that's actual bodily harm, so a fairly serious violent offence, while shopping in Home Bargains. Their first arrest was at age 18, and that was for shoplifting. Their first drugs offence was dealing ecstasy at school at age 16. Their first arrest for a violent offence was at age 17, another actual bodily harm, and carrying a knife this time. Sorry. And what's not on this slide is that they have 10 intelligence mentions up to the age 18, including at their old address where they used to live. So I would like you to decide what the algorithm would say about this person. Is he at high risk of committing a knife crime? Everyone say yes. Who's yes? Okay, I'm seeing quite a lot of yeses. Who says no? You're the algorithm. I have a few minority reports out there, but hardly any. Okay, so the algorithm would say that this person is at high risk of committing knife crime. Now, take your algorithm head off, put your police officer head on. And I'm going to give you some additional information about this person that is not datafied in the algorithm. This person lives with their long-term girlfriend in a flat. They have a 2-year-old child. They attend and are responding to drugs rehabilitation program. They have a job as a mechanic. The other party to this actual body harm that the person has just been arrested for was an ecstasy dealer from school who he has not seen since then. And the other party was arrested too. In respect of the intelligence mentions, the previous address was of somebody who was arrested for other offences. And the arresting officer for the recent offence has the highest actual bodily harm arrest ratio in the force. So now you are the police officer. You have 2 bits of information. You've got all this information, and you have the output of the algorithm. Is he at high risk of committing knife crime? Any yeses? Yeah, we've got some minority reports. Any no's? Okay. That's very interesting. I've done this presentation 12 times, and I have 100% success rate of people changing their mind. So I'm quite pleased with that. But, I mean, it's not a scientific experiment, obviously. But I think it demonstrates that we have to be really careful with data in environments where we are taking decisions about individuals. The data that feeds into the algorithm is certainly relevant data, but is not the only data that we need to use. And much of the data, for example, on this slide, is information that we can get from administrative data, more contextual information, information that we need to know about individuals' lives. And that's why it is so important, especially for high-stakes environment like policing, that the algorithmic approach does not, in my opinion, take over. So just some final thoughts. I think I'm just about on track. I think it's really important that we think about how research will be applied. We don't want to limit the sort of research that is done with administrative data, but we do need to give thought to how it's likely to be used in those sort of operational environments that we're trying to influence. What if the use results in some sort of wrong or misleading outcome? Can we put more limitations, confidence indications, caveats, contextual information on those pieces of results to help people know, help those police forces, for example, that are very keen on using research, help them to know how it should be used, but what are the limitations of using that result? And bearing that in mind, do we need to tell people more about how research outputs might be deployed when we are getting that informed consent? Do people need to know that? Do they need to know more about potential operational uses so that they can give that truly informed consent? So thank you very much for listening, and thank you for being such good algorithms and police officers. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Marion. That's a fantastically thought-provoking start to the conference. So that was brilliant. And when I said it's a ever topical theme, you know, we got a near live update from the legal ruling, so it's kind of proved my point. So thank you. So I'm here to coordinate questions. I think we've got a roving mic or two. Yeah, we have. There you go. And look, I'm sure we're going to. I can see your hands going up already, so I wasn't really worried that we'd have a lack of questions. Okay, the one nearest you there.
Hi, I'm Jo Knight from Lancaster University. Thanks very much for the talk. I have one question around, in terms of the algorithm, for me, the consequence of the algorithm is really important as well as what goes into it. So if the response is going to be positive and supportive to an individual, that's very different. So I work in a lot of health research, and it depends what you're going to do. Are you going to pull them in for a screening thing, or are you going to chop a bit of their body off? And therefore, that needs to play in, doesn't it, as part of the conversation in the decision-making process?
Yes, I hope everyone can hear me, yes. The point made, I think, just in case you didn't hear it, I think was around what is going to happen, what is the intervention that might result from the output of an algorithm? Is it going to be supportive for an individual or not? And that is potentially relevant to how we might think about it. Yes, I would agree, perhaps up to a point, because I think one person's supportive intervention might be another person's intrusive interference. So we can't necessarily assume that what I might think of as a supportive intervention, somebody else might think of in the same way. But I do agree that when we look at how algorithms might be used, we do need to look at what the consequences are of the interventions. We think about that a lot in the police ethics committee. I think when the ethics committee was first formed in 2019, the police were really surprised that we wanted to know what police deployments, interventions, actions might result from them using the output of these data analytics tools. They thought, well, why is that anything to do with the technology? But actually, it absolutely is. If you've got a tool that is going to decide whether somebody's arrested, is very different to a tool that might just be giving an indication of further investigations, and perhaps the same in the medical sphere. You know, if it's really going to inform an intrusive operation as opposed to just further tests, you might be more happy to have some higher levels of false positives there rather than not. Does that? Yeah, okay.
One, yeah, couple down the front.
I'm not sure who is first, Bill.
Hi, really interesting, thank you. Oliver Anderson, Department for Education and University College London. It wasn't the point that you were making, but something that the way I interpreted your police example was around triangulation of evidence. So as sort of a policy official, I wouldn't want to be making a big decision on like one piece of evidence. I'd be looking to look at several sort of pieces of evidence. And that just sort of struck me from your example. You see one piece of evidence from the algorithm, it's interesting, it's useful, but then you get a second piece of evidence, you triangulate and you see something completely different, and together you can make a decision based on, you know, really you'd want it to be look at a whole range of evidence. So just an observation around that.
Yes, I take the point that it is only one piece of evidence. We do need to be careful, though, that these tools do not prioritise the decision-making process and become the only piece of evidence that's considered, or that individuals are overly influenced by tools that are designed to just give them the answer. And we see sometimes the interface of these tools designed so they hide the sort of uncertainty around the data analytics. It doesn't tell you that actually what you're seeing is a probability or a likelihood. It just gives you a traffic light, you know, red, green, orange. So how that is really difficult to then, well, what do I do with that and how do I compare it with all the other bits of information that I need to consider? So I think if a police officer had been told this is actually just a probability, it's like a piece of intelligence, it's got a confidence rating attached to it, then they're probably actually much more comfortable with analysing that. If they're given just a really stark piece of information without any context, then it's much harder to deal with that. But you know, I absolutely agree with you. It is just one piece of information. So if we can ensure that is very clear, that would be really positive.
I'd like to follow on both from the first question and also particularly on your response to it. Thinking of the analogy with medical diagnosis and screening, there's a lot of debate in the medical field, not just about the predictive models, but what happens and their predictive probabilities. And built into that is what happens afterwards. And I wonder if these police models that you're discussing should not just be discussed much more in terms of what the police forces might actually do with them. Does that item come into the discussion? Oh, I should say I'm Gillian Raab from Edinburgh.
Yes, I think that's fundamental. In fact, it should be the first question, I think. What is going to be done with the tool? What context is it designed for? I think that the ECHR would actually encourage us to do that, because how can you make that judgment around whether something is proportionate or not if you don't know how it's actually going to be used and what the consequences might be? So sometimes I think the sort of science, the data can be seen as really disconnected from the law, but it's not. Absolutely, whether something is valid statistically, you know, whether it's how it's deployed is absolutely fundamental to judging whether it's lawful. So yeah, I really agree with you.
Just a quick follow-up there.
It's very difficult to evaluate screening programs in medicine because you've changed the system by doing that. So you have to have population studies that see what was the effect of that. Now, the chances of doing that in the law, I think, are pretty small, but it's worth thinking about. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
We've got one just on the front there.
Hello, Mary Cleaton from ONS. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on how linking administrative data kind of feeds into what you've been discussing about the uncertainty of various models. So, for example, the algorithm that you asked us to pretend to be, that has education data in it and it has offending data in it. Well, in the real world, if you were going to get that data, you would have to first link all of your relevant education data sets together, and that linkage would have a given false positive and false negative rate associated with it. You would also have to do the same for your criminal justice data sets. You'd then have to link the criminal not justice data sets to the administrative data sets. Each of those linkages would have a set error rate that the people doing the linkage may have chosen. And then you've got the error rates associated with the actual predictive algorithm on top of that. And so we have these, whilst we have this amazing capacity for all of this data, this administrative data that we can use, and so many insights that we can gain from it, but equally we have this risk of compounding errors because we are linking and then linking and then linking, and then on top of that, using predictive algorithms, AI, whatever. Could you comment on kind of that side at all, please? Thank you.
I think you've sort of made the point that yes, the potential errors of these things sort of feeding into each other, and then something popping out the other end that the user doesn't really understand the context, I think is a high-risk strategy when we're talking about decisions about individuals. It's less so if you want to, say, inform policy or strategic approaches and things like that. I think where these tools are really quite valuable in things like policing, national security, however, is when you're trying to find links between people or situations to then follow up for further investigation. That's when they can be really impactful. But to use them to decide that an individual is a certain type of thing, that's, in my view, very, very risky and likely to take you down routes that you don't want to go.
Right at the back there.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Devon from Policy and Practice. We actually do similar data linking work at an operational level with the local authorities. So, for example, across the West Midlands, we're linking data across adults, children's, fire, police and health on a daily basis. And I guess partly from the question and a little bit from the less so from the presentation, I just wanted to kind of maybe shift the tone towards something a bit more optimistic because, as you say, in the case of Daniel Pelker, if you are linking these data sets, there's more chance that a social worker is going to look into that case. And I think generally working at an operation level, everyone recognizes that they can't just use the algorithm. In actual fact, there's so much fear and concern that sometimes they won't use the algorithm, even though it would possibly lead to better outcomes, like in the case of Daniel Pelker or Star Hobson. So I think these are, I guess the question is more around the tone of the debate, around, yes, clearly there's more information that needs to be taken into account, but I think AI is at a stage where it's helpful but not the complete solution. And actually, if we talk about it in that way, emphasizing that it can be helpful, you probably lead to deliver better outcomes. I don't know if you wanted to comment on that at all.
I couldn't quite hear everything that was said, but I think your point was that there's a lot that can be done with these algorithms when they're linking very relevant data to highlight potential matters of concern that they can then be followed up. So it's one part of that process. And no, I definitely wouldn't disagree with that. And I think it is a case of very carefully designing these tools to make sure that they include the relevant information that is needed, that their analysis process doesn't result in wrong information, because then we have had examples of that in various contexts, and that people understand what it is that they're looking at, and that they know that they should also use, as you mentioned, other information and their own professional judgment. But I think the design of some of these tools that we've seen in policing does not encourage people to do that. But I'm very aware that there are much better designed tools out there that can be much more useful.
In the middle, and be patient.
Thank you. Enrico Vanino from University of Sheffield. Maybe a provocative question, but it might be that the issue is not the methodology or the data linking, but that the people using it are not trained enough in this type of analysis, such as if we don't provide, for instance, statistical inference skills to police officers, or if there is no understanding between the difference between correlation and causality, then they will not be able to understand exactly that flag, right? It's just yes or no. No, that's a probability. So the problem might not be the technology per se, but that people using it are not trained.
Yeah, I think that is a big problem. It's not that people don't want to be trained, but maybe there aren't the programs out there, and that the programs are not really getting down into the reality of what these tools actually are. The recent dialogue around the summit, I think, has not been helpful from that point of view, because there's been lots of talk about AI and frontier tools and all this sort of thing, but actually not a lot of explanation about what these tools really are. They've been sort of overhyped in my view, and they're still probability machines, but that's not really been explained. So yeah, I agree. I think there is a real need for that sort of skills development.
Really great presentation, thank you. I was struck by the term police intelligence. Intelligence is information that is secret, isn't it? It's what spies collect, and its uses are generally almost always for regulatory purposes, investigation, compliance, sanctions, and so on. So it's probably the type of project and type of algorithm that is going to cause maximum alarm to anyone who hears about it. So I wondered whether we ought to do more to distinguish between data linkage that is aimed at operational purposes in a regulatory policing setting, and data linkage that is aimed at operational purposes in more preventative, supportive public service settings, because the distinction might need to be made, otherwise everyone will think that they're being spied on and the police are going to come round to their house.
Yeah, I think sometimes that sense anyway. Yes. I think that I was using the term intelligence really more as not so much about the secrecy side of things, but as a category of information that is deployed by the police to refer to non-evidential information. So information that you wouldn't necessarily put into court, although sometimes it's used, but it's a piece of non-fact, and it might be right, it might not be right. So maybe something that somebody said to you, or an observation that somebody's made about an address. So it doesn't actually have a good side or a bad. It's not good or bad or wrong or right. It might be right, but you don't know. So you've got to categorize it and give it a confidence rating. And in the police, they use a system for that called 5 by 5 by 5, and they analyze the information and give it a rating as to whether it's reliable or not. So in my view, that's effectively what an output of an algorithm is, because it's got a confidence rating attached to it. If you can explain it to police officers in that way, they're more likely to understand what you're talking about, because they're very familiar with the intelligence setting. So I wasn't trying to imply that all this is around intelligence and all secret things. It's about how you categorize the information that you're getting from your data analytics, and then how you decide whether you should have confidence in it or not.
Yeah. We've got time for a couple more. There's one there, and I think there's one at the back there.
Shall I go ahead?
Yeah, go
please.
Thank you for your wonderful keynote. I'm Shada. I'm from the ADR UK Strategic Hub. I guess it sort of follows on the last question. There's a lot of public attitudinal work that shows that the public are broadly supportive of their administrative data being linked and used for research when their privacy is protected, so the data is de-identified. But in the case, and for when it's used for public good purposes as well. But the case of the Daniel Pelker case that you raised sounded like the use of identifiable data for a public good outcome too. And so I guess I'm just wondering how we square that circle of communicating to the public these different public good uses of data in a way that sort of doesn't, in a way that makes them feel as though their privacy is still being respected and protected, and that their data is also still being used for public good purposes too?
That's quite a big question. I'm not sure I have an immediate answer to that. But I do think there's often contradictory messages out there, isn't there, about, we need to link data in order to protect people like Daniel Pelker, but then in the next minute, that's going too far. And the press are not helpful, I think, in that. So I think perhaps using examples of what is trying to be achieved with this linkage, and the fact that it is trying to deal with issues of vulnerability and safeguarding a lot of the time might be helpful. But I don't really have an answer. Thanks.
The red, Emma. Sorry for those who've got their hands up, but if I get us behind schedule at this early stage, I'll be in trouble. So,
Andrea from U Futures Foundation, and I guess I have a question around Kamala Harris's point in data and AI. And I think the point, knowing the US system, I am from the States, is when you have bad or biased data or biased opinions, and how that can make you get biased outcomes and then used in a very biased way. And I guess that's a question for UK data as well, because some of the data, some of the survey data, some of the admin data that's being linked, they have an underrepresentation of certain groups in that data, or they have a way of describing those people in a way that's not helpful, and then it's put in an algorithm that then explains them in another way. And then the output is a very bad intervention that doesn't actually help those people. So I guess the overall question is, how do we remove individual bias or the way people see the outcomes or the algorithm outcome into a way that actually can be used very well to improve people's lives? And I think that could help with the perception, the public good perception for some of these groups, because then they could actually see it's actually doing well, rather than it's just marginalized groups more, especially with relation to the police, to be honest. So
I'm struggling to hear slightly, but I think in terms of the issue of biased data, I agree that absolutely needs to be more work done around really talking about what that means in the data sets that we have in this country, and also more evaluations as to what impact that actually has on the outputs, because I don't think we know enough about that. I mean, for example, in facial recognition, the Metropolitan Police have done an evaluation of their tool from an equitability perspective, the results of which were stated to show that there was no problem. But actually, if you looked at the detail of the evaluation on page 18 or whatever, you saw that when the face match setting of this tool was lowered from 0.6 to 0.5, significant levels of false positives started to occur, and the majority of those were young black people. And so, it's the way that evaluation is done and how it's communicated, I think we still need to work on.
Okay. Yeah. I've been told we've got time for one more. So the first hand I see, right, there you go, straight there. Very good, well done, nice and quick. Next to the...
Thank you. Hi, I'm Shimonti from Institute of Employment Studies. Thank you for the insightful presentation. My question was that we do a lot of policy evaluation work, and oftentimes we have seen that to evaluate an intervention, let's say that has come to us, there is a requirement to link data and identify the target group. So for example, there is an intervention that kind of targets young people who are at the risk of offending. So you have to kind of link data and identify people. And once you have linked, once you have created that algorithm, it's going to be out there. It'll be really interesting to hear your thoughts on that fine line between letting go of, because of the ethical risk of evaluating an intervention that might be sound and might be effective versus the risk of, creating those algorithms that would be out there in the world. Yeah, thank you. That's my question.
Yeah, I think it is really difficult for researchers because you want to create the research, you want to create the tool, but ultimately you can't control how it's used by everyone. So I think all you can do is to try and set those boundaries around the policy and the tool and research that you've done, make those very clear. I mean, I've seen some research projects that have very clearly stated that that although this is has some predictive element to it, it shouldn't be used for these types of decisions, and has set those out quite clearly. I mean, maybe that's an approach that could be considered.